Thank you very much. When I was asked to speak here today, one of the first things I did was I Googled Goodenough and one of the first things that comes up is an explanation of the extracurricular activities that exist here. And there's a big section devoted to the conferences that are run looking at areas of international concern. So that now everyone is sated with pizza and red wine, I'd like to wake you back up again, if I may, by asking for some show of hands. In different parts of the world, you get different answers to this. But if I was to ask you if the situation between Israel and Palestine was an area of international concern, how many of you would think that that would count under that heading? How many people? Okay. If I asked you if Iran's nuclear program was an area of international concern, how many of you would believe that that would be true? All right. And something like global warming and climate change, how many people would think that that was an area of international concern? Okay. I didn't count, but I've got a fair sense of how many people in the room, and it was a big majority. If I had to ask you how many people in this room thought that Scotland having a referendum on independence was an area of international concern, how many people would agree? Not quite so many. Well, I'm here to talk a little bit about why it is an area of international concern and why people in different parts of the world have started getting involved in the debate, but also to talk a little bit about what that means, not just for people in Scotland, but what it means for people in the rest of the UK too. And also take a little bit of a look about why Scotland becoming an independent separate state is perhaps different from other states around the world, and there have been 30 post-war that have become independent, because Scotland is already a nation that is part of a nation state, and what that means in terms of national identity. So if we can look a little bit about why it matters that Scotland is part of the UK and why the UK matters in the world, it's interesting to see the concern that's being raised elsewhere. The debate is very fierce in Scotland. It exists in some areas of the UK as well. But I was surprised a couple of weeks ago when I was at an event with Madeleine Albright, the first female Secretary of State of the US. She was the keynote speaker, and we were having a discussion before. And she was raising her concern that one of the key allies of the US in terms of military and defence was having a big constitutional discussion that may have an impact on something like NATO, which is an umbrella organisation which defends different parts of the realm. We've also seen in a European context, just in the last 3 months alone, the head of the EU Commission, José Manuel Barroso, the Czech Foreign Minister, the Irish Europe Minister, all getting involved in what Scotland's place would be if it seceded from the UK to be part of the UK, to be part of Europe. So we see that there are other people around the world that are looking at what we do here. Now, Scotland's place in the UK matters because the UK matters around the world. It punches above its weight. And if we ask ourselves why, we have to have a little bit of a history lesson. I know there are many people in this room that aren't from the UK, so I'll make it as brief as I possibly can. Scotland and England had a union of crowns in 1603, but a union of parliaments in 1707, so a very, very long time ago. And after that, there were a couple of significant staging points that brought the UK into an area of international prominence. Now, yes, there was the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, but one of the things that really sorted out the UK's place in the world was when Scotland and England stopped fighting each other. There was a rebellion in 1715, another in 1745, which ended in a pitched battle in 1746 at Culloden, which is the last pitched battle ever fought in these islands. And it was only after that happened, it was only after the security question was sorted at home that the UK was able to take on its competitors abroad, competitors like France. And when the UK won the 7 Years' War and we had the Treaty of Paris, which gave control of India and America, that's when you saw the rise of empire. Now, empire is, and is rightly so, a dirty word. And when you look at the way in which the UK has developed, places like the city I represent in Parliament, Glasgow, which had a massive deep water port and very sheltered inlets, it became the second city of the empire because it had huge trade in cotton, had huge trade in tobacco, in raw materials, and shamefully, it had huge trade in people. And only recently has Plantation Quay in Glasgow been renamed Pacific Quay, and that's where the BBC have put their Scottish headquarters, and they try and dust over the history. But what's important about that is the legacy that it's learned. And it's right that the empire is gone, but one of the key things that it did was it changed the language of the world from French into English. Part of that had to do with the rise of America and the industrialization post-1918, but it really did form the status of the UK in the world. It allowed places like Goodenoughcollege to be built. It allowed London to be a world centre. And it allowed places like Glasgow, like Edinburgh, to be key destinations that people still come to today. So that's a brief history. If we go to the more recent history in Scotland, there was a rise of nationalism, people that wanted Scotland to be independent. And in 1997, we voted in Scotland, just the people of Scotland, on whether we wanted a Scottish Parliament or not that would look at some areas, not federalism, but something called devolution and how that would work. In 1999, the Parliament that last sat in 1707 resat in Scotland, and over that time we've seen a huge change in the identity of people in Scotland. And what was designed to be a political solution, where there was a disconnect between some of the decisions that were made in London and how they affected people in Scotland, has actually, I would contend, seen a cultural change too. And just as the Scottish Enlightenment of David Hume, of Robert Burns, of Walter Scott, of Adam Smith grew out of and around the time of the Union of the Parliaments in 1707, so we're having a cultural change in Scotland right now. We're seeing, particularly in popular culture, novelists like Louise Welsh and Andrew Nicholgrove. We're seeing the music of Craig Armstrong, who writes international film scores. We're seeing plays like Black Watch be taken all around the world. Each of them are international, but each of them are informed by their Scottishness. There is a real confidence in Scotland now, a real brio of people who are engaged with their national identity and their national culture. But what's interesting for me is that has also had a relaxation, if you like, in the chippiness that Scots sometimes have with their nearest neighbour in England. So, for example, across the UK, we've had some very British celebrations in the last few years. The Royal Wedding, the Diamond Jubilee, the London Olympics. And people in Scotland were very relaxed about being as supportive as that as people elsewhere in the UK. And I've never seen so many Union flags flying in Scotland in my lifetime as there has been over the last 2-3 years. And what's interesting too is that while the Scottish Parliament has huge powers, it has powers over all law and order issues, it has power over all educational issues, it has power over many transport issues, it has power over a whole range, and it's getting more powers coming too, even without the referendum in a year and a half. It's getting powers over income tax coming. What's interesting about it is that that hasn't led to a rise of nationalism in the sense of more people wanting to be separate from the UK. So while you have a Scottish National Party that's in government in Scotland, what you don't have is the pre-devolution peak of 40% of people supporting a separate Scotland anymore. The Scottish Parliament has allowed the mechanism for a referendum to take place, but what it hasn't done is increase people's wish for the outcome of that to change. The most recent social attitude survey in Scotland, which is one of the biggest surveys that's carried out over a long period of time, has a large number of people involved, it's very thorough, it's done face-to-face, it's one of the best indicators, has now got the idea of independence down at just 23%. So what we've seen, while we have huge political power coming to Scotland, while we see renewed confidence in Scotland, while we see a renewed identity in Scotland, what we don't see is people wanting to make that something separate or different from the landmass that they're part of, from the fact that we still elect MPs that sit in the House of Commons, from the idea that we still share an armed forces, that we share a currency, that we share a foreign embassy network, that we share international development goals. And people in Scotland are rightly proud that we're, contributing to the Millennium Goals. People are rightly proud that our sons and daughters are wearing uniforms and serving in parts of the world and putting their lives in danger to help other people. So in terms of how we look at the idea of identity, I think what's interesting in Scotland is that we have a different tale to tell than other areas around the world where people look. So for example in Catalonia, for example in Quebec, yes, these are places which have, in some cases, language, changes, in some cases cultural changes. But what they don't have is this idea of nationhood entrenched in them that has been unbroken over many, many, many centuries. Also, in terms of Scotland, our difference, our otherness, has been entrenched in law too. Because even when we didn't have a Scottish Parliament, we had a separate legal system, and the laws in Scotland have always been different. We had a separate education system, and our children were taught differently and sat different exams. They had a different curriculum all the time through all of these centuries down there. And I think what Scotland can bring to the world over the next 18 months as people around the world and even within the United Kingdom become more interested in what's going on, is we can bring to the world a sense of an ideal of how the identity of a nation or of a federal region within a larger state can be enhanced in many cases, can be comfortable in many cases, but that doesn't destabilize in any way a modern progressive democracy. It doesn't have to end down the road in secession. And I think what's also going to be important, and for anybody who's a regular visitor to Scotland or is from Scotland, they know that the heat and light of this debate has been turned up quite a lot in the last few months, is that we can also show how a country can come back together after this debate has taken place, and how that we can all work together going forward. So I don't know what's going to happen to my nation in the next 300 years, but if the example of the last 300 years is anything to go by, I hope very much that we can be a key contributor to United Kingdom. We can keep our uniquely Scottish identity, and anyone who knows any Scots know just exactly how unique it can be, but that we can also show a way forward of how you can be part of a larger whole. Thank you.